Something broke. Not a proxy skirmish. Not a miscalculated airstrike in the fog of somebody else's war. Something broke at the state level, between two militaries that have spent 40 years carefully avoiding exactly this kind of direct collision, and the analysts who built careers predicting where the Iran-US confrontation would go, the think tanks, the intelligence shops, the former ambassadors who wrote the books on Persian Gulf deterrence. None of them saw this specific sequence coming. Not this fast, not this direct. This is not a flare-up contained inside Yemen, or Syria, or the waters of Aden. This is happening in Iranian sovereign territory, in Kuwaiti airspace, in the negotiating rooms of Doha, and in the offices of the White House, all simultaneously, all within a 72-hour window that is not over yet. This is not the slow escalation that regional wargamers modeled. This is the fast version, the dangerous version, the one where a single miscalculation in the next 48 hours does not produce a crisis. It produces a theater war. Welcome and thank you for being here watching Frontline with John. This channel exists for viewers who want real context, not just headlines. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing so you never miss a story that actually matters. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from today. What happened on Thursday, May 28th is not a chapter in the Iran-US conflict. It is a new book entirely. Since the conflict began escalating in its current form, both Washington and Tehran operated inside an understood, if unspoken, architecture of restraint. Proxy forces absorbed the direct hits. IRGC-linked militias fired at American positions. American airstrikes hit militia infrastructure. The flags on the equipment pointed one direction. The chain of command pointed another. Everybody understood the game. Everybody maintained the fiction. That fiction is now gone. At some point in the early hours of Thursday morning, the fiction died near Bandar Abbas, and what replaced it is a direct state-on-state kinetic exchange between American military assets and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a body that answers directly to the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Not a proxy, not a partner force, the IRGC itself. And the location was not a gray zone. It was sovereign Iranian territory at one of the most strategically critical nodes on the planet. This is not future speculation about where the conflict might go. This is the conflict arriving. Right now, tonight, let's walk through exactly what happened, hour by hour, because the sequence matters enormously. According to US Central Command, CENTCOM, American intelligence assets detected an immediate threat developing along Iran's southern coastline in the early morning hours of May 28th. The threat assessment was specific enough to trigger active countermeasures. American forces intercepted and shot down 4 Iranian one-way attack drones. These are not sophisticated platforms. One-way attack drones are exactly what the name implies. Cheap, expendable, designed to fly into a target and detonate. The IRGC has used them extensively across the theater, deploying them in mass salvo configurations to overwhelm air defense capacity through sheer volume. 4 drones down. That part of the engagement went according to plan, but the 5th drone changed the calculus entirely. US forces identified a 5th drone, actively preparing for launch, at a ground control station located near the Bandar Abbas airport. This is not a peripheral location. Bandar Abbas sits at the northern edge of the Strait of Hormuz. It is the entry control point for one of the most trafficked and strategically sensitive maritime choke points on Earth. The airport and its surrounding infrastructure serve as a critical node in Iran's ability to project power into the strait, to monitor traffic, to coordinate IRGC, naval operations, and to stage assets for rapid deployment. Whoever controls the ground operations infrastructure at Bandar Abbas has a hand on one of the world's most important valves. CENTCOM made the decision to strike the ground control station, a direct kinetic strike on Iranian sovereign soil. American officials framed the strike in the most careful possible language: measured, defensive, proportional, intended to preserve the integrity of the existing ceasefire framework. The message was surgical precision, minimum necessary force, no desire for escalation. Tehran heard something entirely different. Iran's response came within hours. At 4:50 in the morning local time, the IRGC launched aerial projectiles at what they identified as the American airbase from which the Bandar Abbas strike originated. The IRGC did not initially name the target publicly, but the answer came from an unexpected direction. The Kuwaiti General Staff of the Armed Forces issued a formal statement confirming that Kuwait's national air defense systems had been actively engaged, intercepting what they described as hostile missile and drone threats. Explosions were reported across Kuwait, a GCC member state, a country hosting substantial American military infrastructure, a nation that has not seen direct hostile fire of this kind in over 3 decades. Let that land for a moment. The IRGC fired on Kuwait, not on a US naval vessel in international waters, not on a proxy position in Yemen or Iraq, on Kuwait, on a sovereign Arab Gulf state whose air defense batteries were lighting up before dawn on a Thursday morning to intercept incoming IRGC. Ordnance. This is the sequence. US strikes Iranian soil at Bandar Abbas, IRGC, retaliates by firing at Kuwait, an American ally hosting American troops. Kuwait confirms its air defenses are actively engaged. And somewhere in the middle of this, the ceasefire that everyone was supposed to be honoring is either still technically in place or has already ceased to exist, depending on which capital you ask. The strategic significance of what just happened cannot be overstated, and it comes down to a single concept: plausible deniability. For years, arguably for decades, the US-Iran confrontation was managed through a deliberate architecture of indirection. Iran funded, trained, equipped, and directed proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. The IRGC, Quds Force coordinated operations that killed American troops and threatened American assets, but always through intermediaries. This gave both sides a crucial off-ramp. Tehran could claim it was not responsible for what its partners did. Washington could calibrate its responses to partner forces without triggering the full weight of a direct interstate war. The fiction was mutually convenient. It was also structurally load-bearing. It held the ceiling up. That architecture relied on one critical assumption: that neither side would execute a direct, acknowledged state-on-state strike on the other's sovereign territory or allied forces. May 28 just proved that assumption is no longer operative. The US hit an installation inside Iran. Iran fired on an American ally. The buffer zone has not thinned, it has evaporated. Both militaries are now operating on what analysts call hair trigger alert. Postures where the response timelines compress, where the decision authority pushes down toward field commanders, where the margin for error contracts to nearly zero. For context, the last time we saw direct acknowledged kinetic exchanges at this level between American forces and Iranian state military assets. Not proxies, the de-escalation required weeks of back-channel negotiation, third-party mediation, and a series of carefully calibrated public statements designed to give both sides a face-saving exit. That infrastructure takes time to construct, and the current timeline is not giving anyone time. Now let's talk about the technology that defines the current engagement geometry, because understanding the hardware is essential to understanding why the situation is as precarious as it is. The drones at the center of the Bandar Abbas incident are a category of weapon that has fundamentally altered the cost calculus of regional conflict. One-way attack drones, sometimes called loitering munitions or more colloquially kamikaze drones, have become the defining weapon system of the current Iran proxy conflict ecosystem. The IRGC and its affiliated networks have deployed them in staggering quantities across Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and the Red Sea corridor. The economic logic is brutal in its simplicity. A basic one-way attack drone costs somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $50,000 to manufacture and field. The air defense interceptors required to shoot them down. Systems like the Patriot PAC-3 missile cost approximately $4 million per round. The arithmetic is not friendly to the defender. Iran has been running that arbitrage deliberately, forcing American and allied air defense systems to expend high-value interceptors against low-cost platforms at a ratio that is strategically unsustainable over time. The response to this arithmetic has been one of the defining military development stories of the last several years: directed energy weapons and the next generation of lower-cost intercept solutions. Laser-based air defense systems, in particular, represent a structural answer to the drone cost problem. A high-energy laser intercept costs, in operational terms, a few dollars in electricity per shot, effectively unlimited magazine depth, no reload cycle, no supply chain dependency for interceptor missiles. The operational implication is that the IRGC's drone salvo strategy, which relies on exhausting interceptor supplies, becomes significantly less viable against a laser-equipped adversary. The American military has been fielding these systems in theater, and their performance against the drone threat is one of the few asymmetric advantages currently working in the defender's favor. The ground control station at Bandar Abbas that the US destroyed represents the other side of that equation, the command and coordination infrastructure that makes mass drone employment possible. One-way attack drones do not operate autonomously in large coordinated salvos without significant ground-based command architecture. Targeting data, launch sequencing, flight path coordination, communications. All of it runs through nodes like the one that American forces struck on May 28th. Destroying a ground control station does not eliminate Iran's drone capability, but it degrades the coordination capacity for that specific node, forces reconstitution of command infrastructure, and, critically, demonstrates that the United States is willing and able to reach inside Iranian sovereign territory to hit those nodes directly. That demonstration has its own strategic logic. It signals that the previous off-limit status of Iranian mainland infrastructure is no longer operative as a constraint on American targeting decisions. That signal is received not just in Tehran, but in every other capital in the region that is watching this situation develop. The naval dimension of this crisis is equally important and equally complex. Operation Project Freedom, the American-led naval blockade of Iranian commercial shipping, has been running as a pressure mechanism, a tool to force economic pain and extract diplomatic concessions. The blockade has been compressing Iranian oil export revenues, restricting access to international markets, and creating domestic economic pressure that was supposed to accelerate Iran's willingness to negotiate. The theory of the blockade was leverage, sustained escalating economic pain translating into negotiating flexibility in Doha. What the Bandar Abbas strike and the Kuwaiti retaliation have done is inject a kinetic variable into that pressure equation that nobody has fully calculated yet. When active military exchanges are occurring simultaneously with active negotiations, the negotiating dynamics shift in unpredictable ways. Hardliners on both sides gain ammunition to argue against concessions. Moderates lose the political ground they need to justify flexibility, and the military postures that are supposed to be the backdrop to negotiations start looking less like backdrop and more like the main event. Which brings us to the Strait of Hormuz, because while the Bandar Abbas sequence was playing out kinetically, the diplomatic track was experiencing its own acute crisis, one that has the potential to be just as destabilizing as anything happening in the air and on the water. The Strait of Hormuz is the most strategically significant maritime choke point on the planet. Approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply transits through it. At its narrowest point, the usable shipping channel is approximately 2 miles wide. Iran sits on its northern coast. Oman sits on its southern coast. The United States Fifth Fleet operates throughout the Persian Gulf region, with Hormuz as one of its primary operational concerns. For decades, the question of who controls, or who can threaten, traffic through the strait has been the central strategic anxiety of the entire Gulf region. Iran has periodically threatened to close the strait as leverage. Washington has periodically declared that any attempt to close it would be met with immediate military force. The standoff has been stable precisely because both sides understood the other's red lines. Those red lines are now under direct negotiating pressure. Iranian state television leaked specific details of the draft Memorandum of Understanding currently under negotiation in Doha. The details that leaked are the ones that lit the fuse. The draft framework apparently includes a clause that would grant Iran, in bilateral cooperation with Oman, localized regulatory control over shipping lanes within the strait itself. The specific language has not been fully published, but the general architecture of the proposal would give Tehran a formal, treaty-recognized role in administering traffic through the choke point. From Iran's perspective, this is a sovereignty argument. The strait's northern waters are Iranian territorial waters, and Iran has a legitimate claim to administrative authority within them. From Washington's perspective, and from the perspective of every energy importing nation on Earth, this is categorically unacceptable. President Trump's response was unambiguous. He publicly threatened to bypass traditional diplomatic protocol, an extraordinary statement in itself, and declared that the Strait of Hormuz consists of international waters. He warned explicitly that if Oman attempted to cooperate with Tehran to restrict transit through the strait, the United States would resort to what he described as devastating military force. This is not a nuanced diplomatic signal. This is a direct public ultimatum aimed at both Tehran and Muscat simultaneously. The geopolitical implications of that ultimatum extend well beyond the immediate crisis. Oman has historically played a unique and enormously valuable role in the Gulf as a back-channel intermediary between Washington and Tehran. Oman has brokered communications, hosted negotiations, and provided the quiet diplomatic infrastructure that prevented several previous crisis moments from becoming catastrophic ones, threatening Oman publicly, even conditionally, risks damaging that back-channel architecture at precisely the moment when back-channel communication is most urgently needed. The broader negotiating picture reveals a fundamental structural disconnect between what Washington is trying to achieve and what Tehran is willing to contemplate. The Trump administration is attempting to use Operation Project Freedom, the Naval Blockade, as leverage for what analysts are describing as a grand regional bargain. The American ask is enormous. Complete termination of Iran's nuclear enrichment programs, sanctions relief tied to comprehensive geopolitical concessions, and potentially linking the entire framework to an expansion of the Abraham Accords normalization architecture across the region. This is not an incremental negotiating position. This is a maximalist demand set that assumes the pressure of the blockade and active military operations will force Tehran into a comprehensive strategic realignment. Former diplomats and regional analysts have been blunt in their assessment of this approach. The word delusional has appeared in multiple expert commentaries. The structural argument is straightforward. Constructing a comprehensive multi-nation diplomatic framework while active combat operations are simultaneously ongoing along the Israel-Lebanon border is not difficult. It is, according to the analysts who have spent careers in this region, essentially impossible. The political conditions that would allow Tehran's leadership to sign on to the kind of comprehensive concessions Washington is demanding simply do not exist while Iranian aligned forces are actively engaged in kinetic exchanges and while Iranian sovereign territory has just been struck by American munitions. Tehran's counterposition is equally firm. Iranian negotiators are insisting that no framework will be signed without explicit immediate sanctions relief and the guaranteed unfreezing of Iranian sovereign assets that have been held in various international accounts. These are not negotiating maximalist opening positions, or at least Iranian officials are not presenting them as such. They are framed as non-negotiable preconditions. You release the money first. Then we talk about what comes next. Into this already complex negotiating environment, reportedly unorthodox proposals have emerged, including a proposed $300 billion post-war reconstruction fund designed to channel American corporate investment in energy and real estate sectors specifically into Iranian infrastructure. The political reaction to this proposal has been severe generating backlash from hardliners in both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. In Washington, the objection is straightforward. Rewarding Iranian aggression with a massive investment windfall is politically toxic and strategically perverse. In Tehran, hardliners argue that allowing American corporate penetration of the Iranian economy under the guise of reconstruction funding is a form of economic colonization that the Islamic Republic cannot accept without betraying its foundational principles. What this reveals is a negotiating environment that is not simply deadlocked on specifics. It is structurally misaligned at the level of fundamental assumptions about what a deal would look like, what it would require, and what it would mean for both sides domestically. The market reaction to Thursday's events has been sharp and instructive. Oil prices moved significantly upward within hours of the Bandar Abbas and Kuwait reports reaching international markets. Energy traders are pricing in elevated Strait of Hormuz disruption risk, which is the correct interpretation given what we know about the draft MOU, dispute and Trump's public ultimatum to Oman. Shipping insurance rates for Gulf transit vessels have been moving higher throughout the week, a leading indicator that commercial operators are recalibrating their risk assessments in real time. Defense sector equities, particularly contractors with significant missile defense and naval systems exposure, saw positive movement as markets priced in the likelihood of continued and potentially expanded military activity in the theater. The Gulf Cooperation Council states Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman are in a position of acute discomfort. Kuwait is no longer a spectator. Its air defense systems were actively engaged Thursday morning, intercepting IRGC projectiles. That changes Kuwait's political calculus dramatically. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are watching the Strait of Hormuz dispute with particular intensity. Their oil export revenues transit through that choke point, and any arrangement that gives Iran a formal regulatory role over it is fundamentally incompatible with their national interests. Qatar's position is complicated by its role as the current host of the Doha negotiations and its historically pragmatic relationship with Tehran. China has significant economic interests in Iranian oil imports and in regional stability, but Beijing's public posture has been to urge restraint from all parties, a formulation that commits to nothing while maintaining optionality. Russia's position is similarly opaque. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has the incentive to see the conflict escalate into a full theater war, but neither has demonstrated the willingness or the leverage to meaningfully constrain Iranian behavior at this moment. The European diplomatic architecture, which has historically served as a moderating voice and back-channel facilitator in Iran-related crises, appears largely sidelined in the current framework, a consequence of the bilateral American-Iranian negotiating structure that has dominated the current cycle. Now let's talk about the decision makers and the decisions they are actually facing. In Washington, the core decision sits with President Trump and a small group of advisors who have been managing both the military and diplomatic tracks simultaneously. The choice they face is essentially binary, and the next 48 hours will likely force it into the open. Option 1: formally reject the current draft MOU over the Strait of Hormuz language and accept that this collapses the current negotiating pause. This option is the maximalist path. Hold the line, maintain the pressure, escalate if necessary, and bet that Iran's economic pain will eventually force the comprehensive concessions Washington is seeking. The risk calculation on this option is that Iran, having already demonstrated willingness to strike Kuwait directly, may respond to a collapsed negotiating framework with a significantly more aggressive military campaign, one targeting Gulf state infrastructure, international shipping, or American forward positions across the theater. Option 2. Accept modified language on the Strait of Hormuz clause, language that acknowledges Iranian interests without formally granting regulatory authority, and keep the negotiating process alive. This option preserves the diplomatic track but requires Washington to accept a partial outcome that hardliners will immediately characterize as capitulation. The political cost of this option domestically is significant. The strategic benefit is that it reduces the probability of immediate escalation, while creating space for continued pressure through economic rather than military means. The evidence points toward the Trump administration leaning toward the maximalist position. The public statements have been unambiguous. The tone of the ultimatum to Oman was not that of an administration preparing to accept compromise, and the military posture, with additional American naval assets either already in theater or repositioned following Thursday's exchanges, suggests that Washington is preparing for the possibility that the negotiations collapse and the military option becomes the primary instrument of pressure. In Tehran, the decision architecture is equally constrained and arguably more internally fractured. Supreme Leader Khamenei is navigating between the institutional hardliners, the IRGC, commanders, the faction that views Thursday's exchanges as proof that resistance is the correct strategy, and the pragmatists within the system who understand that the combination of the naval blockade and continued military losses is compressing Iran's strategic options in ways that are not sustainable. The Kuwait strike is a data point in this internal argument. Hardliners will interpret it as a demonstration of Iranian deterrent capability and resolve. Pragmatists will note that firing on Kuwait, a GCC member state, a country with legitimate international sympathy, further isolates Tehran diplomatically and provides Washington with additional justification for whatever it chooses to do next. Khamenei's historical decision pattern in previous crisis moments has been to authorize escalation as a signaling mechanism while simultaneously maintaining back-channel communication to preserve exit ramps. The question is whether that pattern holds when the back-channel infrastructure, including the Omani intermediary role, is under stress from Washington's public ultimatum. The Iranian negotiating team in Doha is operating under conditions of extreme domestic political pressure. Any concession on the nuclear file, any rollback of enrichment programs, will be characterized by hardliners as a fundamental betrayal of the Islamic Republic's core strategic deterrent. The leaked MOU details the Strait of Hormuz clause in particular suggest that Iran was attempting to extract maximum territorial and regulatory concessions as a substitute for nuclear concessions. If that exchange is off the table because Washington will not accept Hormuz regulatory language, then the negotiating architecture loses its core trade-off mechanism and it becomes very difficult to see what a deal looks like. The critical variable that neither side has fully accounted for is time compression. Negotiations of this complexity, covering nuclear programs, sanctions architecture, maritime rights, and regional geopolitics simultaneously, normally unfold over months or years. The current framework is operating under a 48 to 72-hour horizon defined by military posture and kinetic exchanges on the ground. That mismatch between the complexity of the diplomatic challenge and the speed of the military situation is itself one of the greatest sources of instability in the current moment. Let's close with where things actually stand right now, tonight, as of the information available. American naval assets remain in the Gulf in postures consistent with both defensive containment and potential offensive operations. The naval blockade, Operation Project Freedom, continues. Iranian commercial shipping remains restricted. The pressure mechanism is still running. Strike packages targeting Iranian mainland military infrastructure, including IRGC, facilities well beyond Bandar Abbas, have been reportedly pre-vetted and are available for rapid execution if the operational decision is made. American air assets in the theater include platforms capable of sustained deep strike operations against hardened targets. Tanker aircraft, aerial refueling platforms, have been observed at elevated operational tempos throughout the week, which indicates that extended flight operations against distant target sets are being actively supported and rehearsed. On the Iranian side, the IRGC has demonstrated Thursday morning that it will not absorb American strikes on Iranian soil without a direct military response. The Kuwait engagement suggests that Iran's retaliation calculus has expanded, that IRGC commanders are willing to strike at American allies hosting American forces, not just at American assets directly. This broadens the potential target set for Iranian retaliation significantly. IRGC naval assets in the Gulf, fast attack craft, anti-ship missile batteries, and mine-laying capability remain postured in ways that could threaten commercial and military shipping through the strait on relatively short notice. The ceasefire, such as it is not holding in any meaningful operational sense. It is more accurate to describe the current situation as a pause in heavy operations with active kinetic exchanges occurring at the edges. That is a fundamentally different and fundamentally less stable condition than a genuine ceasefire. In Doha, the negotiating teams are still present. The talks have not formally broken down. But the distance between the two positions on the Strait of Hormuz, on the nuclear file, and on the sequencing of sanctions relief means that the talks are not currently moving toward resolution. They are moving toward a deadline, a moment at which the gap between the negotiating positions and the military postures becomes impossible to bridge with words. If Washington formally rejects the current draft MOU, specifically the Hormuz language, the operational pause disintegrates. CENTCOM will likely shift from defensive containment to a broader pre-vetted offensive campaign targeting IRGC. Military infrastructure across Iran's mainland, the IRGC, will likely respond with its most significant missile and drone campaign of the current conflict cycle, aimed at Gulf state infrastructure and American forward positions simultaneously. The shipping lanes through the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supply moves every day, will be the immediate focal point of whatever comes next. The destroyers are positioned, the air assets are on standby, the strike packages are ready. The strait sits between two militaries whose patience with each other expired somewhere over the southern coast of Iran before dawn on Thursday morning. The next decision belongs to Washington. The next 48 hours will tell us whether the negotiating architecture holds long enough to matter, or whether the military postures that were supposed to be leverage have already become the conflict itself.